welcome to Not Another Sports Show, NASRadicalSports.com, a radical look at the world of sports. Our show is available for broadcast on college and community radio stations, low power FM stations, and in any of the over 180 stations of the Pacifica Radio Network. If you can't listen live or happen to miss any of today's show, you can get access by subscribing to our podcast feed on iTunes, through Stitcher Radio, or the Google Play Store. Editions of our broadcast are also available at NASRadicalSports.com. Send us your feedback, your thoughts about program coverage, your ideas for future shows, and any updates to sports stories that you happen to see. Facebook.com/NotAnotherSportsShow, at NAS Radio Sports on Twitter, NASRadicalSports@gmail.com, or the NASRadicalSports.com contact page. We have a whole lot to get into with this week in the Ides of March, but first we do want to send some big props to the University of Illinois Graduate Employees Organization for winning their nearly 2-week-long strike to guarantee tuition waivers, and also some big props to the West Virginia educators who won their Wildcat strike as well. That many of these things are very intricately connected to sports, because when we're often talking about funding for education and social services in schools, that money is usually taken away from social services and schools and those funding mechanisms to go towards coaches, stadia, and other decisions to start funding top administration in some of these programs. That we start to see money being shifted to stadiums in the various parts of the sports world, or we start to see it given to football coaches and basketball coaches in Division I because they, God forbid, can't pay any of the players. Well, we have a absolutely stacked broadcast here for you this week, and we are going to get right into it, talking this week in pro football. In pro football news this week, the Miami Dolphins owner Stephen Ross had a real life-comes-at-you-fast moment. The Miami Dolphins owner was receiving an award from a local group, and it was a local civil rights group talking about how he was honoring the legacy of Jackie Robinson, which the Ross Race initiatives have been the very liberal end of the NFL owners' networks to pushing out ideas of racial justice. And during that talk that he had, he said, quote, "All of our players will be standing," close quote, in reference to the national anthem and the number of players who took a knee in protest of racial injustice that happened to be during the national anthem. He said, quote, "Initially, I totally supported the players in what they were doing. It's America, and people should be able to really speak about their choices. When that message changed and everybody was interpreting it as that was the reason, then I was against kneeling. I like Donald," referring to Donald Trump, "I don't support everything that he says. Overall, I think he was trying to make a point, and his message became what kneeling was all about. From that standpoint, it's the way the public is interpreting it. So I think that's really incumbent upon us to adopt that. That's how I think the country is now interpreting the kneeling issue," close quote. No, Mr. Ross, that's not how the country is largely interpreting the kneeling issue after Donald Trump said it. People were mad about it because there was kneeling during a song that they liked. An athlete, particularly an athlete of color, decided to take a knee during a song that they liked, and they thought it was more offensive to take a knee during a song that they liked than it is for people of color to be murdered by the state. That says a hell of a lot about their priorities, that they're more upset, that they're more angry, and that they are more outraged that an athlete decided to take a knee or sit down during a song that they like than it does about the lack of outrage that they have for anybody who has been murdered by the state. And Donald Trump's point that he was trying to make was not about what kneeling became. It was his pushing back against athletes of color. We can go back and we can look at everything that this president has done, and you can see how he's pushed back against immigrants. He has pushed back against refugees. He has pushed back against people of color. And when it comes to pushing back against white supremacists, white nationalists, and overt racists, he starts talking about how they're very fine people and that there was violence on both sides. That was not the message, that was not the point he was trying to make about being against kneeling as an anti-military issue. And it's not incumbent on us to adopt that. It's not incumbent on us to push back about it. It's incumbent on us to resist that. It's incumbent on us to start showing that people are more outraged at someone deciding to take a knee and protest during a song than they are about the actual killings done by police, because that is the indefensible part about all of this. That is the indefensible part that they can't sit there and defend, that police officers shoot and kill people, largely people of color. They shoot and kill people and are rarely, if ever, charged, investigated, grand juries don't bring charges, and lo and behold, we very rarely see any of them actually held accountable in court for it. That is the real issue. And people are so mad about someone taking a knee during a song that they like, it says a real whole hell of a lot about their priorities when they're more mad about that and start talking about how we're a nation of freedom and we're a nation of laws and we're a nation that we should be proud to be free, but don't you dare ever try to exercise that, because then we're going to get mad that you're trying to do that. Well, within a day of making these comments, Colin Kaepernick, the former NFL quarterback who sat out all of the entirety of last season, and we saw so many subpar, bargain basement, not good, absolute hack quarterbacks who hadn't been in the NFL for a number of years, haven't thrown passes for a number of years, getting signed by a vast number of teams who needed to bring in quarterbacks, all refusing to sign Colin Kaepernick, who continued to be out there at age 29, continued to be out there as a possibility. Well, Colin Kaepernick is suing the NFL after sitting out for that entire season and alleges that there is collusion happening among the owners to keep him out for his political stand over his protest actions. He was subpoenaed, in this case, the owner, Stephen Ross. Within a day of that subpoena coming to him, Ross said Tuesday, quote, "I have no intention of forcing our players to stand during the anthem, and I regret that my comments have been misconstrued," close quote. What in his comments have been misconstrued? What in the comments of "all our players will be standing," close quote, was misconstrued? Or saying that the country's interpreting the kneeling issue, I really think that's really incumbent on us to adopt that. No, it's not incumbent on us to adopt that. It's not incumbent on us to resist that. People didn't say it was an incumbent on us to adopt, racial resentment in the new nadir that we're in. You can go back to a number of various issues throughout American history. It was not incumbent on us to adopt the very popular ideas when it stood in the face of racial progress or racial justice. It did not behoove us to adopt the dominant viewpoints when it came to transphobic nonsense, homophobic nonsense, racist nonsense, xenophobic nonsense, misogynist nonsense. But it doesn't behoove us to do that. And to say that your comments have been misconstrued, no, they were completely perfectly seen, and that's why you got subpoenaed. That's why you got subpoenaed. They weren't misconstrued. Very clearly, they were not misconstrued. And all of this is coming after the Houston Texans have been alleged to not want to sign anybody who is involved with the protests that were occurring during the national anthem to highlight the various issues of state violence. And of course, the Houston Texans have denied all of this. Now, let's not forget that Colin Kaepernick here is alleging collusion in the league. He is alleging that there was collusion by the NFL owners, saying that they colluded to keep him out. Well, if we have one owner saying that he was concerned about the protests and being against them, and we have another owner, that being of the Houston Texans, who is saying very loudly that he was against the protests and the possibility that he didn't want to bring in people who were involved with those protests. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think collusion is simply just trying to prove that those two people spoke to each other. And there you have, at its most mundane, collusion. At its most simplistic, collusion. It's a hard thing to prove when you get to the full court for Colin Kaepernick, But let's not forget how many subpar, bargain basement, not good, absolute hack quarterbacks were brought in last season in the NFL. I mean, it became almost a weekly occurrence here during the NFL season to highlight which new person that they've decided to go pull out of real estate jobs or go pull out of haven't thrown a pass since 2013. Pulling people out of retirement to bring them in. That we talked about so many quarterbacks coming in and then not doing well while Colin Kaepernick sat on the sidelines and nobody wanted to bring him in. Nobody wanted to. And we have to realize that it's related in part to his politics. It's related in part to his protest. And when you have an owner like that of the Houston Texans potentially saying that he didn't want to get anybody who was involved with the protests, of course, that also coming after he lost a whole lot of support in his locker room for essentially saying that prisoners were like inmates running the asylum, and then having to walk that back and try to say that he didn't actually mean what he said, to Stephen Ross saying that all our players will be standing, and that it's incumbent on us to adopt the majority viewpoint, then saying that his comments have been misconstrued simply because he was facing down a subpoena from Colin Kaepernick's legal team. Meanwhile, Miami Dolphins player Kenny Stills took an off-season RV road trip through the American South recently. He planned a kickoff event in Miami, but then heard about a prison reform protest in Tallahassee and drove overnight in his RV to make it to the protest. And he was there and he started tweeting out his RV road trip saying, quote, "Met with Dream Defenders to protest for fair treatment of incarcerated individuals. Was my first time on the front lines. Empowering feeling to be a part of. Although those in charge wouldn't open a dialogue, we made our voices heard," close quote. He then continued to talk about how, quote, "Left the RV in Atlanta for a day to speak on the Athletes for Impact panel. Incredible to share the stage with that great group. Appreciate Dr. John Carlos for his advice. Won't ever forget that moment. Leaders like him paved the way. Flew back to Atlanta and drove to Charlotte for the Women's March. Wanted to go last year, but I was so hyped to make it this time. Our country needs more women in positions of power and leadership. Will always be a huge supporter in their fight for equality. We went to the National Civil Rights Museum. Super emotional experience. Learned so much about the work of Dr. King, but also of those others who dedicated their lives to battling for equality and justice. Was dope to be back. Got to catch up with a couple of homies and participated in Know Your Rights camps with Colin Kaepernick and his amazing team. Camp blew me away. It was an honor to be a part and connect with others that are like-minded. Proud and inspired by the work my brother is doing." This is some awesome stuff that we're seeing athletes being full-rounded people, being involved in politics. And Kenny, of course, making the symbolic protest during the season of taking a knee, the symbolic protest of sitting down, the symbolic protest of staying in the hall before they got to the actual stadium after a while to make his statement known about his protest. And not only taking that symbolic protest, but now moving into the on-the-ground work and being involved with people, as he put it, on the front lines, doing a lot of the work. And being involved in some of these protest actions and getting involved with on-the-ground grassroots organizing. Hopefully it leads to more on-the-ground grassroots organizing work with Kenny Stills getting involved and continuing to push and advocate for these politics and advocate for these agendas. It's very, very awesome to see. Meanwhile, the NFL is having a very big issue yet again with the questions that are being asked to rookies. An anonymous team front office hack asked running back Darius Geis if he was gay and that, was your mom a prostitute? And these questions for a number of years now have been done. They were done to Des Bryant a number of years ago. So they can see how they'll react. And they can check their temper and they can check how they're going to react to people purposely prodding them and purposely, causing them problems. But it's a totally inappropriate question for your employer to ask. It's a totally inappropriate question for your employer to ask you. Now, certainly, there's a bit more media attention that's given to athletes than to anybody else in their day job. But if you went to apply for any job at all, and your manager in the interview asked you if you were gay or asked if your mom was ever a sex worker, think about your reaction to that and then start to recognize what you think Darius Geis's response should have been here. And this isn't demeaning of sex workers at all. Sex work is valid labor. Like, we have to come to that understanding. These questions are done so largely so we want to see how these players will react. And they use these kind of metrics and they use these kind of insulting ideas about people's families and about people's parents to start pushing this kind of ridiculous agenda. The executive director of the NFL Players Association, DeMaurice Smith, said, quote, "Find out what team did it and ban them from the combine. The question is inappropriate. Questions along these lines are always inappropriate." And the NFL has announced that they are looking into it. And wouldn't you know, they have told all the teams a number of different times that this is not okay. And we've seen the anonymous team with Des Bryant and the fact that they didn't really get punished. The NFL can come out and make these pronouncements about how they're going to look into it, or how they're going to address it, or how they've talked to all the front offices about how this is not okay. But it makes me wonder if they're actually going to do anything about it, since they look into these issues all the time, and there's very scant history of them actually doing anything. That teams are not going to change these kinds of front office policies without, one, an educational component, and two, consequences if they engage in the behavior. Pat Griffin, the fantastic LGBT writer and activist on these issues, majorly involved in a lot of campaigns about these sorts of things, talks about, when we had her on the show a number of years ago, it's not only consequences, but it's also the educational component. And we've certainly seen the NFL claiming that they have this educational component about why these things are not okay, why these things are problematic to have happen in the workplace. But there needs to be consequences, lost draft picks, mass fines, that there needs to be front office consequences. We even see this when there's been issues about concussions. And the NFL has said that we shouldn't diagnose concussions over television, even though we have a guy twitching involuntarily on the TV screen. And they don't actually really do anything to really investigate or punish any of these teams, but then they come out and say that the policy is going to be this really strict thing, and then they never actually use it. You can think back to the mandatory minimum 6-game domestic violence policy, and then a guy gets popped for domestic violence and gets a 1-game suspension. That the NFL loves to announce big, overarching policy ideas. They love to announce that they're seriously going to investigate something. But when it comes to the actual doing anything about it, there's very scant little that we can see in their past record that makes me wonder if they're actually going to do anything. And this is another instance where the NFL has said, well, we've talked to all the teams about it, and we've educated them. Great. Now comes the next step. Actually implementing consequences. In other health and safety news, former New York Jets linebacker Mark Gastineau of the New York Sack Exchange in the late 1970s, early 1980s, has come on the air and started talking about how he has been diagnosed with both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And, quote, "I want the NFL to treat people right. I want you to hold you to your promise, Roger Goodell. You said anything I need. I want the players to be treated right." He thinks his Alzheimer's and Parkinson's is from his 10 years in the NFL, but the NFL will probably say, no, it's not. It's from all sorts of other issues, or your genetic predisposition, or the fact that he had 17 pro boxing matches, that they're going to highlight all these other issues to avoid having any kind of real responsibility. He said, quote, "The NFL is wrong. The NFL is wrong. They're wrong. I'm not telling them to give me zillions of dollars. I don't want zillions of dollars. I want to be treated with respect. My wife will tell you she helps me get out of bed, and she helps me remember names." And you know that the NFL's not going to be treating you right. You know for a fact that the NFL will not be treating you right. they've made it so hard by denying that there was any kind of connection between football and long-term brain trauma. They denied that fact for years, despite the fact that while they were openly denying it, they were paying former Pittsburgh Steelers lineman Mike Webster full disability benefits for football-related brain trauma. Or let's not forget the rheumatologist that they had that headed up the committee on studying brain injuries and the outright real refusal to address it in any serious actual fashion. Or the committee that gave the no-strings-attached donation to the National Institute of Health to start studying brain trauma and concussions related to the NFL, and that it actually had many strings attached, and that the NFL sought to have that money put into the hands of researchers that were very cozy with the league, while publicly proclaiming that it was a no-strings-attached donation. That the NFL very clearly has made it so hard to get real, verifiable evidence, that they have at best been ignorant about it and at worst actively stopped a real investigation and done their best to make it so incredibly difficult and so incredibly problematic for actual research and actual work to happen. They should be treated right. And of course, these statements and these promises. Well, with promises and 75 cents, you can go to a soda machine and get yourself a soda. I'll believe Roger Goodell's statements, I'll believe Roger Goodell's push when I actually see it having real benefits. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, NASRadicalSports.com, a radical look at sports. We've just been talking about the NFL's Miami Dolphins owner having a real life-comes-at-you-fast moment. Activist athletes and political and health statements being made by athletes in response to league misbehavior. Coming up, we are going to be talking about some NBA athletes and destigmatizing issues of mental health and college sports resistance as well. So let's get into it with This Week in Basketball News. After the Toronto Raptors star DeMar DeRozan came forward on Twitter very publicly with his struggles with depression, saying that his depression had gotten him down, he spoke more about it in a longer interview with the Toronto Star and said, quote, "It's not nothing I'm against or ashamed of. Now at my age, I understand how many people go through it. Even if it's just somebody can look at like, he goes through it and he's still out there being successful and doing this, I'm okay with that." And it wasn't just influencing regular, everyday, grassroots people like you and I. It was also influential to his colleagues in the NBA. And Kevin Love came forward and wrote an article for the Players Tribune to talk about his issues with anxiety, and talked about his panic attacks that he suffered and had to come out of 2 games, that he had to leave a game in November and a recent game in January with panic attacks. And he described them the following way. Quote, "The air felt thick and heavy. My mouth was like chalk. I remember our assistant coach yelling something about a defensive set. I nodded, but I didn't hear much of what he said. By that point, I was freaking out. When I got up to walk out of the huddle, I knew I couldn't re-enter the game. Like, literally couldn't do it physically. Coach Lou came up to me. I think he could sense something was wrong. I blurted something like, 'I'll be right back,' and I ran back to the locker room. I was running from room to room like I was looking for something I couldn't find. Really, I was just hoping my heart would stop racing. It was like my body was trying to say to me, 'You're about to die.' I ended up on the floor in the training room, lying on my back, trying to get enough air to breathe." Close quote. And to highlight the fact that an athlete, a very prominent athlete, is having these struggles and being able to talk about them in such candor and such detail is something very heartening, especially in an era where, in talking about issues about weapons, we so very casually start talking about how we need to deny weapons to the mentally ill, and that we start stigmatizing mental illness as this very serious problem where any person who suffers from mental illness and has access to a weapon is somehow going to engage in violent behavior, which only reinforces these negative stereotypes and only reinforces these negative stigmas about people who are suffering from mental illness and having these sorts of panic attacks or these sorts of issues. That we only reinforce those things with such blithe representations about mental illness and what we feel is represented by quote-unquote mental illness. And it's really heartening to see Kevin Love and DeMar DeRozan and others start talking about their issues with depression, with anxiety, that so many times these are the invisible diseases, that if a player goes out and plays in a game and messes up their knee and has to have knee surgery to repair their ACL or their MCL or their LCL, and they're out for 6 months, we understand why, and we're okay with them being out 6 months and having to rehab. But if it's something like, I'll be right back because I'm having a panic attack, people are a lot less receptive to that being a real serious medical issue, and it's, get up and play, I do this for free, or, all the other things that people start to say and refuse to recognize the realities of mental illness and mental health. That the ideas of, well, have you tried not being sad? Have you tried not being anxious? All of these really trite tropes that you wouldn't use with an actual physical illness. Like if you saw somebody with a broken arm, have you tried moving your arm? Have you tried not pretending that it's not broken? Have you tried that? We wouldn't stand for that in that kind of scenario. We wouldn't stand for that anywhere in that kind of framework. But when it comes to these sorts of invisible illnesses that are like mental health, we're a lot less receptive. And so it's very heartening to see people like Kevin Love, people like DeMar DeRozan and others coming out and making these statements. Love continued in his article saying, quote, "If you're suffering silently like I was, then you know how it can feel like nobody really gets it. Partly, I want to do it for me, but mostly I want to do it because people don't talk about mental health enough, and men and boys are probably the farthest behind." And that is such an accurate point in this, that we have the idea of a toxic brand of masculinity where we're not supposed to show any kind of emotion. And if we do show an emotion, it's only at a funeral or at some very serious occasion where we're allowed to show any kind of human emotion that's not overt aggression. Love followed it up saying, quote, "Growing up, you figure out really quickly how a boy is supposed to act. You learn what it takes to be a man. It's like a playbook. Be strong. Don't talk about your feelings. Get through it on your own. So for 29 years of my life, I followed that playbook. And look, I'm probably not telling you anything new here. These values about men and toughness are so ordinary that they're everywhere, and invisible at the same time, surrounding us like air or water. They're a lot like depression or anxiety in that way," close quote. And he's absolutely right. We've so normalized these ideas of real men are strong and they don't talk about their feelings and they just have to get through it on their own. And we start pushing these negative ideas about what it means to be masculine and what it means to be a man, to start pushing through and really stigmatizing any kind of mental health care. That if you broke your arm, you wouldn't sit there and say, I need to be a man and get through this on my own. No, you'd go to the ER and you'd get a cast and get it fixed. And it's heartening to see professional athletes like Kevin Love, like DeMar DeRozan, coming out and highlighting these issues about the connections between toxic masculinity and mental health and the stigmatization of mental health, that we have all these ensuing issues of the toxic masculinity aspects, that we also have these issues of it's become really in vogue right now to start stigmatizing mental health in the talks about guns and weapons in this country, that it's automatically just a shorthand almost to say people who have mental health issues shouldn't have a Second Amendment right, or people who have mental health issues shouldn't have this right and should be really watched and monitored by the state, and which is something that we would not really accept, and that's something that's re-stigmatizing people who suffer from mental health, and it's not going to help the situation with people going to get health care. It's not going to help the situation in having people recognize that they can go get services, and that people can get it, and that we do need to talk about mental health enough, especially with men and boys, and especially in circles on the progressive left of how it becomes a very dangerous re-stigmatization of mental health care in those kinds of scenarios and in these kinds of systems. We really, really need to be talking about this more, and I'm really happy that two prominent NBA stars have used their platform to start this conversation that will hopefully continue over the coming weeks and the coming months. Meanwhile, in unpaid college sports news, Temple University wants to build themselves a new football stadium in North Philadelphia. Of course, cue here, your Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I'll leave you a moment to sing it. North Philadelphia is notable not only for that, but also for being a prominently black neighborhood, and it's one of the major seats in the city's history of civil rights campaigns and racial justice campaigns in the city of Philadelphia. Well, Temple started looking at the idea of building a new football stadium all the way back in 2015. Now it's 2018, and they're holding a community meeting this past week. How many community meetings has Temple University held in the approximately 3 years now that they've been planning this stadium? If you guessed this one being their first, you have the absolutely correct answer, listener. In 3 years, this is the first community meeting they had. And they've talked about how this is not going to have a major effect on North Philadelphia. This is going to have a very minimal effect on North Philadelphia. The entire time, though, they have refused to involve North Philadelphia residents in any of the decision-making of any of the proposals. In fact, they won't even release their studies on the impacts on the local community, like the traffic impact, even though the proposed stadium is going to close down 2 blocks of downtown North Philly for a major throughway for that neighborhood. They will not turn over the traffic impact studies, but claim, trust us, it's going to be minor. Why would they be trusted when they haven't had a meeting with the community in over 3 years? Why would they be trusted when they haven't sought out the expertise, the experience, and the desires of the community where they want to put this stadium? Why would they be trusted? Hand over the traffic impact studies. Hand over these investigations. Hand over this information. Or recognize that the local residents don't want you there, and don't put a new stadium there. The local residents have started a group that they're calling the, quote, Stadium Stompers, and at the first public meeting from Temple, the meeting got shut down because there were so many critics of the proposed plan that these are people who live in a community that have a very strong connection to their community, and it's one of the most notable communities when it comes to civil rights in Philadelphia, in this neighborhood. And they're not being involved in these decision-making. They're not being involved in any kind of serious way, and they're simply being told what to do by a major institution wanting to come in and put a new stadium in place. And it's always a bad look, and of course we always have to talk about the tangential issues and the very real issues of race in this, that we have a primarily very white institution of academia coming in and telling a very large community of color, we know what's best for you. We're not even going to turn over the information to you to explain why we've made the decision that we're making. We're not going to really listen to you at all in any substantive way. We're not going to give you any of the research of how this is actually going to affect you. You are simply going to accept the fact that we are going to build this stadium for you, and that you will probably be priced out of actually being able to go to any of the games, and it will have a very serious impact on your community, but we're not going to tell you how much of an impact it's going to have on that community. Meanwhile, in San Diego, basketball coach Lamont Smith has resigned 2 weeks after being arrested on domestic violence charges, and the state deciding that there would be no actual charges filed. Lamont Smith has resigned, and good on him. He probably shouldn't have stayed in that job, given that he was arrested, because simply not being charged does not mean that you are innocent. Meanwhile, the Westboro Baptist anti-gay extremists are protesting a openly gay high school football player who will be attending Indiana State in the fall. Jake Bain is this football player who is signed on to play with Indiana State. And the Westboro crew is going to the high school to protest this high school senior who will be playing at Indiana State. The Westboro crew is really just trolling it up here, that they've almost hit peak troll of a bunch of adults actively trying to bully a high school kid. It reminds me of the right-wingers right now going after a lot of the high school activists from Florida. And certainly you can have your very real and very valid left criticisms of the gun control movement, given the very racist history of gun control and the very racist implementation of gun control in the American past, and the very, very big realities that could happen again, and that taking away guns is not necessarily the way to solve the problem, because we've seen how prohibition fails in a number of different ways. But the Westboro Baptist anti-gay extremists going after a high school senior. There's plans to have a massive support rally to drown out the Westboro Baptist Church, and the Indiana State soon-to-be freshman is going to be heartened by that and very much want to send our support and our solidarity to him as well. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, NASRadicalSports.com, a radical look at sports. We've just been talking about pro basketball players destigmatizing mental health issues, especially after they become such a bogeyman lately, and the grassroots effort of Philadelphia residents against a new football stadium for Temple University. Coming up, we'll be talking about the Olympics, FIFA fails, and stadium greed getting challenged by the state and in the streets in the world of Major League Soccer. Coming up in our final segment of this week's broadcast, Other Sports News. In other sports news this week, we are going to start with the Olympics. The House Committee investigating Olympic sexual misconduct has expanded their investigation. Originally, they were just looking at the U.S. Olympic Committee, USA Gymnastics, USA Swimming, USA Taekwondo, and Michigan State University. Now they have expanded to all 48 governing bodies of Olympic teams for the games where the U.S. is involved. In a letter justifying their expansion, they said, quote, "Based on information received to date, the committee is concerned that a pervasive and systemic problem exists in Olympic sports. The safety and well-being of all athletes should be the highest priority of the U.S. Olympic Committee and each of the respective national governing bodies. It is imperative, therefore, to understand the scope of this challenge across the Olympic community to ensure existing and future efforts to improve athlete safety are commensurate to the problem." And this is heartening to see the beginnings of an investigation, because the U.S. Olympic Committee, USA Gymnastics, USA Swimming, Michigan State should not be necessarily investigating themselves. After 200 plus women came forward over the allegations involving Dr. Larry Nassar, that we had the allegations involved with USA Swimming with adult coaches and teenage swimmers, that we've seen a whole host of various issues, all just absolutely skin-crawling, that the highest levels of the athletic committees, the highest levels of the U.S. Olympic Committee, at best, were derelict in what they were supposed to do, and at worst, according to the allegations of a number of gymnasts, including Aly Raisman, were simply just told to be quiet, and that the doctor was a professional and that he knew what he was doing. And when they started to raise these alarm bells and start talking about the abuse and start highlighting these issues, that instead of doing a very serious investigation into any of it, instead of doing a very serious push into cleaning this up on an institutional level, they instead decided to have non-disclosure agreements signed by people like Aly Raisman, to keep everything very quiet and to keep everything very hush-hush, and to not really take any real systemic change on. And we've seen a number of USA Gymnastics heads decide that they are going to leave their positions. We had the head of the U.S. Olympic Committee decide to step down and said that it was due to his cancer that he was suffering from. And while it's heartening to see these individuals leave their jobs, because of the abject failure that they had in doing their jobs to protect athletes. We also have the very real problem that it's not cleaning up the institution. There's still a culture in that institution where these things are okay because there's winning of medals, or that these sorts of things will simply be tamped under the rug, or sign this non-disclosure agreement, or please be quiet, he's a professional doctor and he knows what he's doing. That we need to have a reckoning with how all of this took place, with the institutions itself, to make that happen. And the House committee, I doubt, is going to have that kind of real top-down, deep investigation into this. And one of the only places where I think any of that is going to happen is from the grassroots level, where you have gymnasts like Aly Raisman taking the U.S. Olympic Committee to court to start demanding that they seriously address this, to start demanding that they very seriously start handling these issues, to really make sure that there is a culture change, to make sure that there is a mass institutional change, to really push forward the idea that simply people removed from their jobs is not going to be enough. Recognizing the failures of how all of this happened is not enough. But to make sure that athletes are safe in the future, that we really have to clean up the institutional systemic rot that is so deeply pervasive in this. That's what needs to happen, and there's very little faith that any of that is going to happen with the House committee, that it's going to take a real deep and critical push on these issues. And given how a lot of America really only focuses on the Olympics once every 4 years, it's a concerning thing to see that kind of reality happen, where simply as it goes out of the limelight, as the Larry Nassar case is now fading into the back of the media landscape, how many people are going to be paying attention to this and very rightly and very seriously demanding that there be some systemic, serious, absolute change that must occur in the U.S. Olympic Committee, as well as USA Gymnastics, USA Swimming. That there needs to be some very serious systemic changes to those institutions before any athletes can really feel safe. Meanwhile, in soccer news, FIFA is under fire for a number of reasons. One of them, of course, Qatar, the 2022 host of the World Cup, has been under fire for all sorts of labor violations and labor abuses, of having a system of kafala where your passport is taken by your employer and your employer can deny you the right to leave the country and refuse to give you back your passport. And we've had stories in the past highlighting those issues. Or the workers working in 120-degree heat and the migrant laborers not being paid or being paid very, very poorly. And we've highlighted a number of these labor rights abuses, from stories by Amnesty International, from stories by labor rights groups and workers' rights groups doing on-the-ground investigations, investigative reporting by groups like The Guardian, and highlighting the very real systemic problems that comes with hosting these kinds of mass sporting events, whether it's FIFA and the World Cup or the IOC and the Olympics, that we see these major labor rights abuses happening when these things come to town. Well, the latest report is out and says that working hours exceeded 72 hours per week at 8 different construction companies in Qatar. 72-hour weeks. 72 hours in a work week. A number of people worked 5 months without a day off. 5 months without a day off. 96% of new workers were paid an average of $1,250. $1,250, working 72 hours a week, up to some of them working for up to 5 months without a day off and getting paid $1,200. Some of the construction workers were noted to work up to 14 hours a day. The legal limit in Qatar is 10 hours a day. And 402 hours within a month, which is 90 hours over the actual limit. The report also noted that 8 construction companies of the 19 had employees who worked too many consecutive days without taking a break, which means at least 7 days in a row. Well, we've had some people work 150 days in a row. And one contractor where, quote, 3 workers worked between 124 and 148 consecutive days without a rest day, close quote. FIFA, ladies and gentlemen, saying that Qatar can still host the Olympics. Qatar has been promising change and promising movement on all of these labor rules and saying that things will change and that we need to wait and follow through and wait 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 and wait. And we've waited, we've seen that there's small incremental changes happening, but every single time there's still more abuse. And it's not just FIFA here. It's the institutions of holding these kinds of mass sporting events. And these mass sporting events don't have to be this way. We can love the beautiful game. We can go love all the awesome stuff that comes at the Olympics. You know, with the Winter Olympics recently, everybody became a curling fan because curling's awesome. We can have these mass sporting events. We can have these really awesome examples of sport without the greed, without the labor abuses, without the police state, without the violence that comes with hosting them and the targeting of local communities. We can have these awesome things without these really negatives. And when FIFA claims that it's in support of workers' rights and people's rights in the host countries, we simply just have to point to, yet again, another instance of labor rights abuses, like this one in Qatar, where FIFA has said less than nothing about it. But FIFA saying less than nothing might actually be a small improvement over the really mealy-mouthed statement that they did let out of their mouths involving Iran recently. The nation of Iran has a rule that's been in place since 1979, since the revolution, that women cannot attend sporting events. Saudi Arabia even allows women to attend sporting events. And friend of the show, Shireen Ahmed, did some absolutely fantastic work in the Shadow League, talking about Iran's arrests of 35 women for daring to attend a soccer match, the Tehran Derby. A number of women dressed up as men to be able to go, and 35 of them were detained. As Shireen notes in her article, the youngest one was 13 years old. And they were arrested and detained and then allowed to potentially leave or were transferred elsewhere after the game was actually over. Now, the Tehran Derby and the arrest of these 35 women is galling and egregious enough, it's misogynistic enough, just on its face. It becomes so much more than that when the head of FIFA, Gianni Infantino, was sitting in the stadium when this was happening. Gianni Infantino was at the game when this was happening. Gianni Infantino was there when this all occurred. And afterwards, grassroots groups on the ground in Iran, like Open Stadiums, asked for a statement from FIFA about how they could possibly defend this kind of policy. And the mealy-mouthed statement from FIFA was very much about how they've talked to President Rouhani, and these sorts of things need time, and these sorts of things we can eventually progressively possibly change, but they need time, and we gotta wait it out and wait and wait and wait. Well, 1979 to 2018 seems like it's a long enough time. I think women can be able to go. Women should be able to attend sports games and be fans in the stadium. It's not that big of a radical ask. Meanwhile, here stateside, the city of Columbus, Ohio, and the state of Ohio have sued the Columbus Crew of Major League Soccer and their owner, Anthony Precourt. Anthony Precourt bought the team, and he very clearly wants to move the team to Austin, Texas. And he wants a new stadium, and to their credit, Columbus and Ohio won't give him the money to finance one. So he wants to move the team to Austin. Well, Ohio, after losing the Cleveland Browns, passed a law known as the Art Modell Law for the former Cleveland Browns owner that says an owner can't move a team that gets any public money without 6 months of notice and optioning for the team to be sold to a local owner first. The Attorney General of the state of Ohio, Mike DeWine, says that the team has to pay no property taxes on their current stadium and that they've gotten $5 million for parking and other infrastructure. So they have received public money. They've gotten public benefits to not actually have to pay taxes, to not actually have to follow many of these rules. Therefore, they have to option the team to be sold to a local owner or give 6 months of notice. And so they are suing the team and this owner who want a brand new stadium and want to rip the team out of Columbus and move it to a location that is much more to the owner's liking. If this leads to the potentiality of collective ownership of the Columbus Crew, it would be heartening and it would be awesome because the fans very really want to keep this team. The fans very rightly want to keep this team, and it would be absolutely fantastic to see them to be able to have access to push this team and keep it in their community as the jewel that it is there. Meanwhile, FC Cincinnati also wants to build their own stadium in the West End, despite their residents not wanting it, there being nothing wrong with the current stadium they're playing in, and the owner simply just wanting more money. Not that there's any actual problem with the stadium. Well, Julie Sellers of the Cincinnati Federation of Teachers talked about how, with the stadium that's being proposed, there is talk of giving tax abatements. Tax abatements and allowing them to not have to pay property taxes is something that happens very, very often with a number of teams getting brand new stadiums. And she looked into it and found that the property taxes would be approximately $5 million. $3.2 million for the schools and another $1.7 million for other social services. And certainly I would prefer not $5 million going to an owner for a new stadium. I would prefer that you don't spend public money on a $200 million stadium and then give these mass tax breaks. That would be my option one. My option A would be really preferring not to give a very wealthy owner $5 million in tax abatements and a lot of money to build a $200 million stadium when the community doesn't want you there. There's nothing wrong with the current stadium, and there's plenty of things to be funding currently with that money, like schools and social services. But if it did have to happen, if it did actually have to occur that we unfortunately have the reality where the public is going to be funding these brand new stadiums for FC Cincinnati, then don't let them have the tax abatements. Don't let them have the tax abatements. Make them pay taxes. Make them pay for the costs of property taxes. Because when these teams do not have to pay property taxes, those costs indirectly go back on the residents. Because the residents' taxes have to go up to cover those costs. The residents are the ones who have to pay, while the billionaire owners are the ones who get to go off scot-free, and in this case, not have to pay $5 million in tax money for that proposed stadium in the land where it's proposed to be built. Make them pay the taxes. Make them pay. Make them pay. The ultra-rich stadium owners should not be exempted from having to pay taxes, from not having to follow the rules. They should very much be on the ball for having to pay. They should have to pay. Now, that's my backup plan. My very first absolute plan is not giving a whole bunch of public money for a $200 million stadium to a very wealthy owner, because there's nothing wrong with the current stadium and the place where they want to build this stadium. The residents don't actually want them there. So listen to the residents. Listen to what those residents want and how they're arguing against this proposal. But if we have to go with it, then make them pay taxes. Because The taxes come back on residents to have to pay more. And then we start seeing the disintegration of social services. We start seeing the lack of funding for schools and social services, that we start to see the lack of funding for social programs and public things that the public would value. In Cobb County with the Atlanta MLB stadium, that they said that there was going to be all this magical, wonderful fairy dust, coming down and being fantastic with this brand new stadium. Well, now they're talking about how they're probably not going to have enough money for libraries to be built. And that the money that was earmarked for public parks is going to that arena, and they're now having to siphon off other money to try to pay for this stadium proposal. And giving money to billionaires to build these stadiums is something that's short-headed, it's wrong-headed, it's problematic, and it's something that we really need to keep addressing and keep pushing back against and keep highlighting how much of a very serious problem it is. Because when we start looking at states where we have increasing militant activist action happening, that we have so much money being delegated to very, very wealthy elites, while many of the working class of state employees, of educators, are going without, that we have Oklahoma threatening to have a strike, that we have teachers in Kentucky threatening a militant labor action. We had the West Virginia teachers in a militant labor action. We had the University of Illinois graduate employees in a militant labor action. That we have these very real connections between the prioritization of funding for stadiums for these billionaire owners to get incredibly wealthy, while we're siphoning money away from social services, while we're siphoning money away from all the programs that actually help the public, so the already rich can get just a little bit wealthier. This has been Not Another Sports Show, NASRadicalSports.com, a radical look at the world of sports. Our show is available for broadcast on college and community radio stations, low-power FM stations, and in any over the 180 stations of the Pacifica Radio Network. If you can't listen live or you happen to miss any of today's show, you can get access by subscribing to our podcast feed on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, or through the Google Play Store. Editions of our broadcast are also available at NASRadicalSports.com. Send us your feedback, your thoughts about program coverage, ideas for future shows, or updates to @NASRadioSports on Twitter, Facebook.com/NotAnotherSportsShow, NASRadicalSports@gmail.com, or NASRadicalSports.com's contact page. We have an exciting set for the rest of the month coming up for you on this show, talking about the ensuing baseball season, the politics of that, basketball season, the latest updates in college sports and international news as well. We're also trying to get some interviews scheduled and lined up for the upcoming weeks, and we really are interested in bringing those to you here on NASRadicalSports.com. Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media. We'll talk to y'all again next week.